Okay, now to cover CSS Grid. I do hope that you have completed the tutorial for CSS in Code Academy and especially the CSS Grid for this. This is not, although this seems like complicated, it's only complicated because there's lots of flexibility in how you use Grid. Um, it is not complicated in terms of, well, it's not as complicated as what we used to do, right? So what we used to do is use float to do a layout. And because float, you needed to clear float, that means you created lots of divs, extra divs to make this layout work using float. CSS Grid has simplified life for layout like it's just a kind of joy to kind of from what we had to do to use Grid now. And especially when we have responsive design, which we'll cover next week, which is making a website with percentages so that it kind of arranges in different layouts for different devices. As you probably see with a website on a desktop looks different on a phone. Okay. And the beauty of Grid is that Grid can really easily change for those different device sizes. And it takes care a lot of like of the sort of detail work that we used to have to do with previous forms of layout. Now let me show you. I'm going to go. This is the Blackbird project, and what I've done is I've created. I'll show you what I last left you guys with in a layout for the Blackbird. Now what's going on here? I showed you how to take the poem that the ID poem that surrounds all the stanzas is set to a certain width and then floated left. Okay. The bio section, the aside, is also set to a width and floated right. If I floated this left, it would just nudge up against here. Okay. So, and I made sure that the widths of these two items were of a size that fit together within the overall width of the wrapper. Now, if I go into the CSS here, and I'm looking for the poem and the bio. So the poem is 400 pixels, the bio is 400 pixels. If I just show you this quickly, if I say left, that will move that left. I'm going to go back to right. If I make this 600 pixels, it may not fit, in which case it goes down to the bottom. See how it overlaps here? Doesn't fit. So it's trying to float right. It's actually moving to the right, but it's not moving up so that it sits next to this. We need to clear that with a width that fits in. Now, I could probably increase these both a little bit to give it a little bit more. Yeah, so then you see how that works. I've just added 20 pixels to each to kind of squeeze this in a little bit. I could even go further. But that's how we used to do things. And of course, you had to clear the footer, clear both left and right float to have the footer appear. So that's, I mean, I don't want to go into too much detail because that's the old way. But I just want to show you that's where we left off. I do want to mention about just the display property. If I'm using styles 3 here. So if I say to the stanzas, I've removed the 400 pixel width on the bio and the poem, and I've just said width auto. And width auto simply is the default. It's not 100% exactly. If I say 100% and I had padding and margin and border, it would overlap. If I say auto, it allows the div to stretch as far as it can, including those paddings, borders, margins. Okay, if that makes sense. So use width auto or just leave blank when you just want that div to do its thing. Okay. What I was going to say is I've returned the layout so that those stretch all the way across. The floats are removed. And what I've done is I've added to the stanza, which is here, display inline block. And I've given a width to those stanzas. Now let me show you what that does. Sorry, display. So inline block, it kind of creates a little bit of a mess. But what's happening is it's making these stanzas into block level elements with the borders and the padding and the margins. But it's putting them, aligning them at the bottom, as inline does. You notice it's staggered here at the tops, right? And it's saying go in a horizontal row until there's no more room, and then start the next line. Now you can see that this is not a great way to do the layout because of this. You know, what I could do is I could say to the in the CSS I could add a height, but you need to add a height that's going to clear. If I say a fixed height, you'll see what happens. It's staggered still because of, see how this is overlapped here? So this is complicated, not a good thing to use. The way to use inline block is if you just want, you know, a block level element to be sitting in some inline content, not the way to do layout. So I'm going to leave that behind. Now I'm going to show you grid, okay? And before I do, and it's the recommended way to do layout now, before I do that, I want to point you to the W3 School CSS Grid tutorial, which is very good. And I'll just say right now, this kind of thing, right? If you have a container and you put your items in that container, what you're saying is applying a grid to the container so that the children go into a certain position, defined like this. And I'll explain that, but that's what's going on. You apply the grid to the container, the parent, and it tells the children, these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way to 9 items, to behave in a certain way. And if you say 3 columns, it will go in 3 columns, like any kind of arrangement, okay? And you can also apply CSS properties to the items themselves, okay? Now, I know it looks a little kind of confusing here, but my favorite guide to this is this complete guide to grid. And because it has on the left side the properties for the parent, and on the right side the properties for the children. That is the container for the grid and the items for that grid. And what that means is that you can decide how many columns, how many rows you want on the container, and then you can decide, well, how do you want the children, the items, to be positioned within that grid, okay? This is a reference, and I know it looks very complicated, right? I just recommend to you that as you become a web developer, you're going to learn to do things faster and easier over time. But at the beginning, I just recommend saying to yourself, sketching out a design for a layout, what you want to go for, and figure out how to get that to work in as efficient and easy a way as possible. You don't need to pile on all this stuff. It's not necessary. And I'll try to explain that. You don't want to make grid too complicated for yourself because the purpose of grid is to make things easier, okay? So that's a good reference. I'm also putting a reference here to Flexbox. It's a similar thing with parents and children. And I just want to point out really quickly here, what Flexbox does is creates direction for, it's basically, the way to think of this is that it's when you're trying to create like horizontal alignments that go down the page like a grid. It's very good with that, but I think grid can do those things better now. And I'm pointing out Flexbox because there are, for example, this justify content. If you say center, you can center items very easily. And you can combine flex with grid, no problem. So I will be returning just a little bit to Flexbox, but this is a reference just in case you're interested. Okay, so the demos here, I recommend, I'm going to be opening this in TextWrangler in a second, but I do recommend you go to both of these and get the source code, Command-Option-U on a Mac, and just copy all, Command-A, Command-C to copy all, and then put that into a new TextWrangler item, file, and save as grid demo .html. Okay, and that will allow you to be playing with these two things, and I'm going to show you what they are. And here's another one. Okay, and this other one is just an example of how a layout. I have a float version. Now these columns are floated left, right? But this you see what happens here is that you can't control the height. Now there were tricks to do here with padding and stuff, but it was not a very elegant way to do it. Flexbox could do that. You notice the alignment here. Flexbox is very good with centering text exactly in these boxes, but still CSS, this example is the way to go. And I'm combining Flexbox here by centering these items. And what you're seeing, and I'm going to get to this in more detail next week with responsive design, but a grid system like this can easily be switched out to different layouts when we do different device widths, okay? So this is an example really about responsive design, but I'm just showing you the different ways of laying out content like this, okay? All right, and you can grab this, and you can grab the source code of any of that stuff and play with it if you want. Okay, now I'm going to open the grid. I'm going to first show you how we can use grid in the Blackbird project, and then I'm going to leave the Blackbird project for those demos I had. Okay, so this is the grid way of doing things. If I open this up, you'll see I have all the stanzas in a grid. And how is this done? So this is using the styles 2. And the wrapper has its 900 pixels and so forth. There's nothing there. I'm sorry. It's the poem that I'm just okay. So the poem, remember the stanzas are in the poem, and the stanzas themselves do not have a. I mean, I have a width commented out here, width and height, and I could put and this is the old way. If I wanted a grid of the stanzas, I could set a width and a height. And I could say float left to all the stanzas, and they would just go up into a grid. They'll do their thing. But then we still have to clear the float and all that. So same idea, but using grid, we take the container, which is the poem, the hashtag poem that has all those stanzas in it. We do not need to apply any height or width to anything with the stanzas. I mean, we can put padding. We can put padding on the stanzas. But no need to kind of like set whatever you're guessing for columns. The grid system takes care of it. So what do? We say display grid. Remember, display block, inline, display flex. Now we display grid. What that says to the ID poem is go into a grid, and I'm going to tell you how to go into grid. Now, if I just want there to be 2 columns with each stanza side by side going down the page, I can say grid template columns, which determines how you want to arrange those columns, and I can say 1 fraction, 1 fraction. That means of the total space of the poem, of the hashtag poem, split it into 1 fraction and 1 fraction, right? If I did like this, that's 3 columns. If I did like this, that's 4 columns. And I hesitate to do this. We'll see what it does. All right, well, it fit. So that's a 4-column arrangement of the stanzas. I'll show you a 3-column. That's a 3-column arrangement. Now see how it all is taken care of? And watch, if I go up and I put in padding here, I'm going to give it, what, 3%? Well, I'll do pixels. I'll go 5%, 5 pixels. Let's go 10 pixels. 10 pixels. And so you see that even with those 10 pixels, it didn't change anything. I mean, if I were to do that in the previous way, we'd have to adjust the 10 pixels from the widths and all that stuff. It just works, and I can't impress upon you enough how easy this is compared to what we have to what we used to do. Now, there's no need to use rows here. What I mean by rows is you can say grid template rows, and if you had a fixed height, you could spread out those stanzas or divs in rows. Like say if you have 1 fraction, 1 fraction, 1, that's 3 rows. But we don't want to do that because we don't have a fixed height. Remember, the wrapper and the poem ID are just, there's no height, so that they just unfold with whatever the content is. If I set a height, then I'm limiting, you know, the space, and then the arrangement has to go however I determine the rows to be. So the easiest way to approach this is just to set your columns, and I'm going to go back to a 2-column. Now another thing is you can combine things. You can say 300 pixels and then 1 fraction. In other words, make the first column 300 pixels, and then the rest is just 1 part of the remaining. Now you can also, if there were 3 columns, you could say 20%. You could say 300 pixels, 20% of what's left over, and then 1 fraction. Right? I'm not even sure what that would result in, but you can see there. That's 300 pixels. That's 20% of what's left over, and that's 1 fraction of the total. Okay. So you can combine values like that. Easiest is just to use the fractions, I find, like that. The grid gap is the spacing between things. Now you can see there's a 5-pixel gap between the divs there. If you use percentages, now let's say if I say 3%, the problem with that is that it would show up on the width, but it wouldn't show up on the height. In fact, I guess it did, but the problem with height in most cases, I mean, the problem with percentages with height is there's no way to determine the actual height of the container div. So height is a little tricky in that sense. I mean, height in percentages as a value. I'll get into that probably in the recipe project. But that's a little quirk. So just if you want a gap all the way around, best to use pixels in this case. Okay. Remember, width auto is just determining, just letting the div do its normal thing. It's the default. And stretch the full width of the container. Okay, so that's an example of just getting your stanzas into a grid-like system with grid template and the columns, setting a grid on the columns. Okay, now what I'm going to do is switch over to, I'm going to pause and I'm going to switch over to the 2 examples demos for the grid I have. Okay, so this is one of 2 demos, and I put those CSS Grid Demo 1 and 2 in the page. I'll show that to you in a bit. Well, I can show it to you here. These 2. So if you copy the source code and put them into your text wrangler, you'll be able to play around. So what this looks like is this. Oops, I've already done it. So let me remove some of these things here. Well, what I wanted to do is reveal this to you, but I guess, let me just see if I can get this. Okay. Save get it back to, okay, that's what I want. Let me just quickly see the header has got, it's got display grid here. Okay. I think this is something of what you have. And now what you're seeing is just the normal flow. There's a header green, there's another content area with these boxes, and there's an aside and a footer. Right. So what I'm trying to show you is that without any grid, this is what things do. This is what divs do. They stretch their container. This, by the way, this wrapper's got a set width. Now let me explain this very quickly. If I say width 80%, that means that width of that container, this grid container, will be 80% all the way. But as I get bigger, it stops growing. You notice it stops growing. It's no longer 80%. Okay, what that means is that I've set a max width to 900 pixels and a min width to 500 pixels, so that when I go smaller, it will not, at 500 pixels, it'll stop right there and it will not get smaller. Okay, so width, max width, and min width. You use a percentage and then fix pixels to say stop growing at this width, and then also on the min, stop shrinking when you get to 500. Okay. Now, inside, I'm going to display a grid. And because I have a height of 600 pixels, you can see that height here, right? That height allows me to use rows to work in this layout. Okay, it does. If you didn't have a height, there's nothing to kind of determine how to distribute rows. Okay, so notice if I say now display grid for the container, and I'm going to say grid template columns, one fraction, one fraction, one fraction. That's a 3-column layout. And the grid template rows are one fraction, 3 fractions, 1 fraction. What that means is the middle row is going to take up 3 places to the 1. Okay, so let me just show you. If I save this and you see what happens. So we have 3 columns. Oh, actually, what I want to do is, sorry, what I want to do is show these different things like this. Okay, so I go this way, and right, so the immediate children are the ones that go, of the container, are the ones that go into the grid. So if I say 3 columns, the header is going to go as one child. It goes to one column. The main is another column. The aside another column. Then there's no more room. Starts now to another column. Okay. So if I block off the grid template columns and then open up the grid template rows, you'll see what happens. Now this is saying in the rows, the middle one is going to have is going to be 3 levels. Okay, so now we have 1 fraction, 3 fractions. What does it say here? Oh, okay. So 3 fractions, 1 fraction, and then the footer is not part of the rows there. So I could add 1 more and say 1 fraction, and you'll see how this changes, right? So now this header, this aside, and this footer are all 1 fraction, and this is 3 times that. You see how that works? That's a distribution of the divs on that 600 pixel height. Okay. Now, so that's how rows and columns work, and they're just, and you can actually in CSS, I mean in Text Wrangler, you can start writing it, and you'll see the options start to appear. Okay. Now there is another way to do a layout, And I want to show this to you because it's a little odd. It's a little different. Actually, I want to comment out on, well, I think I want the grid template columns, but I want to come out the rows. So if I put the columns in, I say, yes, I do want the 3 columns, right? Give me 3 columns, equidistant. I can use something called grid template areas to name my layout. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm naming the parts of the page to go into a certain arrangement that I want. And what I'm saying here is on the first row, I want a header and a header for the 2 columns, and the 3rd column is the aside. Now, I'm breaking a line here because it's better to visualize it that way, but there's no comma, no semicolon here. It breaks a line, and then in another quotes, you have main, main, aside, and then footer, footer, footer. However, in order to use these names, you have to name them. So that means I need to go down here and turn on these naming systems. So grid area header is naming that header so that I can use it in this grid template areas. Grid area main, grid area aside, and grid area footer. Notice there's no quotes around these. This just says this element is going to now get the name footer and the name aside and the name main and the name header so that I can just name them in my layout, my preferred layout. Notice I have the column set up here, and I'm going to say I want in the first row, I want it to go header, header, aside. The next row, main, main, aside, and then the last, the footer is going to cover all 3 columns. So if I save this and open it, so now you see that we get the header. Now let me see something here. It's distributing actually, it's determining the rows as well by distributing it evenly, if that makes sense. So if I say header, header, then it's going to find its way to cover those 2 columns, and then the last one's aside. And then the main is going to cover the 2 columns, and the last one's aside. So now we get the whole aside filling in on the last column except for the footer, which covers all 3. So you see how that works. You can just sort of decide whatever you want. And I mean, let's say I want to go, the aside is the beginning, right? So if I say aside, header, header, and aside, main, main, that's exactly what it will do. Okay? So that is, if you want to kind of get into putting together a grid that's your own kind of arrangement, this might be a way to do it. I wouldn't recommend this in all situations. You should be able to do layouts just with columns, simple grids. But if you want to get into an more unusual way of doing it, this is one way to do it, is to use grid template areas, and then you need to name those areas in order to use it. Okay? Now the other thing is, I'm going to turn on some of these other things. This is align self, start, justify self, and these are a little bit of things that are actually flexbox. But I can just show you they create a centering of the, well, just a second. I don't know why I have that there, frankly, do not know. I think it was probably to put the H1 in some place, but what I wanted to show you is I can actually nest grids. So if I turn on display grid for the main, the children, which are divs right here, 1, 2, 3, 4, right down here, those I can use to arrange in 2 columns and 2 rows, right? So I've saved one fraction for the columns, and for the rows, save, and you'll see they go into the grid. That is They go into 2 columns and they separate the height, which is determined here, and it separates that evenly into 2 rows. Okay? And there's a little gap there placed with 2 pixels. Okay? So that's one example. And again, you can download or copy the code and of this and then just follow along and kind of turn on some of these things. Okay. All right. The next example is the grid demo 2, and I'm going to turn this on, and this is what it looks like, which means, you know, I didn't show you the. I'm going back to the other grid demo. I didn't show you the how the HTML works. It's just that got the container, right? And remember, it's the immediate children, which are the items for the grid. It won't pay attention to these until I put a grid on the main. Then these are the children that get to grid. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So I'm going to go to this other example, and if I just show you the HTML, this is all it is. We have a grid container surrounding all these sections with an ID for each one, and I'll explain why. There's an H1 in here, and I've numbered them so that it's clear which box is which box. Now the IDs are, in this case, I want to create a grid, but then I want to move the different items within that grid and have them cover the grid in different ways. Okay, so now this gets into the placement of the items in CSS Grid. We talked about before what you do to the grid container, and now we're going to work with the container grid and moving the items within that. Okay, so just going back to what this is the grid. We say display grid, grid template columns, 1 fraction, 1 fraction, 1 fraction. That is a 3-column design. This is just a max width on the width of the container, and there it is. 3 columns, all of those children go into position. Okay? Now, the sections here are I'm saying display block here just because section is a new HTML element. It's technically not block level, although it does break a line. I'm adding display block just to make sure that that shows up as a block level element. We got some styling here. I'm adding a min height on this for 200 pixels just so we can see something. There's nothing in there, right? There's no content in those divs. I've added some padding. And this little bit of display flex is just to center the content in there, right? So I'm saying display flex, justify content center, align items center. That's going to put the content in the center of the div, okay? But I really want to focus on is the grid here. So watch what happens if I take away this comment. I'm going to move it down to here after that. Okay. So I've turned on the styling for section 1, section 2, section 3, section 4. These first sections have background orange, green, and blue. And on the 4th one, right? So there's nothing unusual happening with these, but the 4th one is going to have a grid column start at 2. Now, what does that mean? I haven't changed this yet, but so if I say for the 4th, this is the 4th one. If I say the grid column start is at 2, the column starts begins, this line is called 1, this is 2, this is 3, this is 4. So if I say start at 2, that means I start this box at 2, and then I say grid column end span 2. Now, if I can say the number 4, which would be the same thing. It would mean the end is on 2, 3, 4, which covers these two. If I say span 2, that means cover two spaces, two columns. So there's two different ways they do the same effect. But so that's dealing with the column. And then I say for the row, I say grid row start 1. That means this is 1, this is 2, this is 3 in the rows. So I say start at 1 and span 3 of the rows. So 1, 2, 3, and background red. Now if I save this and show you, that's what happens. Here are the first three, 1, 2, 3, that have been moved aside because I've just taken the fourth one and moved it up at the start of the line 2, right? So this is the beginning of the second column. It's spanning 2 columns, and then I'm starting at the row 1, which is this line, and I'm spanning 3 columns. See how that works? So you can create your grid and then move the items of that. Now you can't go too wild in terms of like breaking the system. Like if you said for this one, start down here, and like it can get a little unwieldy. You want to follow some kind of logic. But now watch what happens if I just cover these. Now the section 5, the fifth grid, the fifth box, has a grid column start 1 and a grid column end span 3, and its background is yellow. What does that mean? We start with 1. Now this is the fifth one, right? We start with 1, span column 3, and background yellow. So I'm going to save this, and sure enough, it's spanning 3, and I think it spans... Oh, so I forced a pixel height here of 400 pixels, but I could easily also, I could say, I could add my rows here and just tell it to, let's say row start. Now for the row start, this is 1, 2, 3, 4. That's the fourth line of the row. 4. And I want to span 2 rows and keep that background yellow. Let's see how that works. I need to span, this is row end. Getting confused, okay? So that that is taking care of that fifth box and saying, it's, you know, there's different ways to do this, but it's just determining the length. Oh, I need to span row start to, I expected this, let me see what if I say 3 here. I'm going to try, so if I start at 4, 5, 6, let's see if that does the trick. Column start 4, grid row end 6. Something, I'm not sure what's going on there, but I'll just leave it. I'll come back to it later or something. I'm going to actually take these away and go back to that. I can force a height that it just extends that down. Okay. I should be able to cover 2 columns. Oh, I think it's because, well, we'll wait on it. Okay, so the next section 6 and section 7 just have the blue and red, and notice that they just start doing their thing. They're not moved anywhere, right? Now, I'm going to keep going. I'm going to move this down further. So we get the green. Now we have one that on 9. 9 starts column 1, spans 1, background dark green, grid row start 6, and we're spanning 5 down, right? So 1, 2, 3. Oh, 5 is wrong. Too much. Need to go 3 here. So 3 columns. So 1, 2, 3 rows, right? So spanning 3 rows, starting at line 6 of row, right? This is the beginning of that row 6. Okay, keep going and you'll see how this all plays out. I'll just remove this. I'll remove that. And now you'll see everything filled in. So let's look at number 10. Background yellow, grid column start 2. So we've done 9. We're starting at 2 here. It's spanning 1 column, starts at start row 6, and goes until row 11. But I could easily replace that with that, which is the same. Oh, no, it would be one more, 4. And it does the same thing, right? So you can either decide the span of how many rows or columns, or define the actual line of the row that you want to end at, okay? So this is, and then the rest of them just go into they have their different colors, they do their thing. So you notice that's how you can do unusual kinds of grids by first defining an overall grid of the parent and then determining what the children or the items do within that grid, right? So you can kind of move things around. And of course, all of these divs can get text and images and whatever you want to put in them. They will not be part of the grid, right? So if you need another grid in, say, 4, you would just, for that section 4, you would define another grid and do whatever you need to do in rows and columns or whatever, okay? All right, I know this seems super complicated, but I think that the way to handle this is to be very clear of what you want. That's why the mini project is this. I've given you this start, okay? You've got the colors in there at least. And your aim is to get the layout to look like this. So you have some options. You could do grid template layout. You could set it up with a container grid and then move the items as I showed you individually to get this look. So with this, make sure you save it in a folder called Mini Project 3. I'll change that. And then index.html, and then upload that. But you can work on it together. Just make sure it works within these links here, okay? Okay then, that is Grid, and we will be doing Grid together in the recipe project. If you want to use Grid for the Blackbird project, you're welcome to, but it's not necessary. Remember, the Blackbird project is due this Friday by midnight on October 2nd. This Friday meaning the coming week. So there's workshops to get help. There's also, you can get with your own pods to get help on the Blackbirds. Certainly you'll be meeting to, I think, talk through this. And then you can also set up individual Zoom meetings. And if, it might be too early if you haven't completed all the tutorials. The next week will be the responsive. Let me just show you this. So this free Code Camp, Code Academy charges for the responsive design tutorial. I'm asking you to go to free Code Camp, and what you're going to do is look under responsive web design certification, not 300 hours. You're going to responsive web design principles. It's just these right here, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So complete these, and I will in the meeting I will look to see if you have all these checked. Okay. And remember, with these tutorials, you need to sign in and record what it is you've completed. So make sure you've done that, and then I can see those scores. Okay. When we meet, that's when we meet by November 1st. I think that is it. But let me know. let me know if you have any other questions. All right? All right. Talk to you later.